So sometimes people who have never seen me type are quite shocked. If they ever are standing behind me when I type something, there's often a giggle and then a laugh. Because my typing, you see, isn't exactly orthodox. I learned to type while working on the high school newspaper and yearbook, and I was so busy at that I didn't finish the touch typing class that we were supposed to take. And at journalism school, Professor Jim Shoemaker, who was immortalized in the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoon strip Shoe by Jeff McNelly, some of you remember it perhaps, it was birds who were hardened journalists commenting on the world. Professor Shoe would sometimes type in class on his battered manual typewriter. While hunting and pecking with 2 fingers, he would bark at us about accuracy, as Marie said. He would talk about the inverted pyramid of facts, which was the goal of every news story. And so when typing, if you ever see me, my left hand uses most of its digits, but my right forefinger is doing this, having a little dance, a little staccato tap dance that is hell on computer keyboards, I'll just say. Facts, though, as Marie said, facts were the reason for the dance. Reporting them, and even better, uncovering them. That was the reporter's dream, an idealistic pursuit. After watching afternoon after afternoon of Watergate hearings with our sitter as an elementary school child. And that same idealism would later propel me to want to be on the other side of the desk in a world of public policy a decade later. And then there's ministry, which has a little bit to do with ideals, but that's a different topic. But to be clear, I covered the long tedium, mostly of local government, not constitutional crisis. And there were egos involved, but they would call and yell if they didn't like your angle in a story, yet nobody claimed to be royalty. And even if it was a myth, we were supposed to do our very best to try to be objective. Now, this is the third part in my series on democracy and our faith. And in our truth and world-rooted faith, we affirm the facts of science and the immeasurable value of beings, human and otherwise. And our belief in the ways that we are connected together has not only been affirmed in the ways in which the destruction here on our soil is crumbling principles of democracy around the world. And I will say, if anyone is following this, that Germany has managed to keep the Democratic Party in the first place, but the second place is something to keep in mind. And at a time when what we most needed was cooperation to address the ticking time bombs of climate change and the global plague of economic inequality, what we got instead was a dismantling of many of the tools we would have used to do that. So this is a time when we need to remember what we believe. In our faith, we are the people who believe in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, who believe in the democratic process as how we should make decisions together, and that know that in order to make informed decisions, we need accurate information. Now, writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, a renegade Unitarian minister who was quoted in our chalice lighting this morning, did say that we should pass the truth of our lives through the fire of thought. Now, no doubt, if he were among us today, he would want even hotter temperatures for searing misinformation, the passing of inaccurate information, disinformation, the transmission of intentionally false information, doxing, using information to bully and harass, or digital bullying, which is like the old stuff of the school halls that many of us have known, but on steroids. He would have wanted us to turn that temperature up even higher, and I believe that might be something we need to do. We have so many more ways now to get information, and it's a challenge for us as people who believe in the ability of humanity to better itself, to hold the many ways it is now used to do harm. I want to be clear about journalism and what it was like back in the day. It was a tough business, led mostly by older white men, and they didn't mess around. And as a young reporter, I was subject to the burn of the copy desk. Shu and many of the other people that I worked with and who trained me were old school. In his class, we actually typed our stories onto 8.5 by 11 newsprint, yellow, and folded it in half to submit it the way that they used to in the newsrooms back in his day, but which no one had even done at that time for decades. Then they would get his scathing pencil marks, even though we were actually, in the next class, going to learn editing on fancy new computers. All the professors, especially Shu, taught us that the ethic of trying our hardest to get closest to the truth, even though we knew it was an evasive ideal. It was sort of like trying to catch the wind, but there was something in the dance that was worth the exercise and effort. And though I started working at other jobs at age 15 and in more than 4.5 decades, I can tell you that by far the worst job I ever had was also related to newspapers. It was because I was enthralled with newspapers and I wanted to be close to them. So at age 17, I took a job selling newspaper subscriptions over the phone. I lasted less than 3 days. And I want you to know, it was the worst job. That same year, I also had, briefly, a night job cleaning banks. That was a much better job. Because journalism in those days was a business just like it is today. Yet, like many businesses in those days, different from today, a business constructed around ideals. People profited, the owners had nicer cars and bigger homes than the employees, absolutely, yet they didn't have millions of times more money than the employees. And a pretty thick firewall actually existed in those days between the newsroom and the advertisers. Yeah, every now and then you had to think twice about certain stories, but it didn't mean they were off the table the way they do now. The last dinosaurs of newspapers have perished. Really, though we have a few that still appear in newsprint, it's because they've also learned to appear in pixels. And they aren't owned by the people with the larger lawns. They're owned, many of them, by hedge funds and other entities whose goal is often to suck the profit out like the marrow from bones. After firing the people or cutting the ranks very drastically or selling off the physical assets of a newspaper, they leave what are referred to as ghost newsrooms, or in recent decades, places where the words are shaped without shame by the ambitions of the owners, ambitions shaped by that everlasting search for profit and personal glory. What has happened with the destruction of information and the buying of newspapers is disinformation that is so intense that there's an increasing lack of interest in whether or not something is true or not true. And many, many more of us at the local level, where we also have very important decisions to make, are living in news deserts with no accurate access to the local news. What does this mean? When I first came to this county, a local paper and a local public radio station covered events such as the Immigration Vigil, to which I'm grateful a number of you showed up for on Friday, and which we had several hundred people attend overall. And while this event, and we have a couple images from this, did much to buoy the spirit of those who were there, and while it was covered by 2 social media journalists, this is one of them covering it, and by the local Fox affiliate, briefly. More disturbing, the larger protests at state capitals were barely covered, and yet the images of many of them spread through social media, inspiring more to participate in protests against these atrocities being committed in our name, one of which in recent days has been the abduction of migrants from our borders and their imprisonment in other nations, coerced to take them because of threats to participate. Images of people, including children, writing messages in lipstick asking for help in a hotel in Panama were first reported by the New York Times, but they spread through social media. And so, this is an important part of how we think about how we get information in a time when many things are happening without the due process of law and thus not recognized internationally. The forms of journalism which were around when I was an idealistic young adult are now often described as buggy whips by journalistic scholars. Social media, which right now in many cases and for many causes is the only form of information gathering, is often blamed by us, including me, for the demise of traditional journalism, and yet the economics and rampant greed is not named as a cause. And while it is true that a lack of nuance in posts, which influencers use to escalate, can create dogmatic thinking, we also have many people as dedicated, trained journalists using social media as a way of getting out information. And so, they still are trying to apply those same standards of truth and higher standards as buggy whip forms become more enslaved to the ideology of their new profit-seeking owners. And of course, there are a few exceptions, but there aren't as many as there were even 2 years ago. As we discussed Wednesday night in the Love-Centered Democracy class, there's a big difference on social media, and we all need to understand this, between people who seek to be influencers and those that are still trying very valiantly, and in many cases with big followings, to be journalists. They're professional, independent journalists who are covering important things and stories that might never otherwise be heard. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge one of the things that's happening online, which is that gurus are advising us to do less news, and I completely agree with that. In the name of accuracy, what they mean is actually, though, to listen to less commentary, whether it's from public broadcasters who for decades have become more privately funded, which is good, or talking heads on the ideological networks on both sides of the political divide where there's very little political nuance. Less is more, really. We need to find out and stay alive, but we cannot keep up with everything that is happening, which is why we need each other. I'm grateful to get together with friends who are covering different things than I am so that I can get the truth that they are watching. Yet recognizing what is true about what you are watching and taking the time to invest in those sources that are generally accurate, for no source is accurate all the time, is an important part of our faith in these times. And it's something that we need to protect the democracy, which has been part of our faith since it came to these shores to escape monarchy before the writing of a new and revolutionary constitution, which is now being mocked every day among us. Yes, bias exists in media in all its forms, and yet what we as people of faith need to counter is that new value of cynicism about everything, except for some reason, the self-declared heroes of hyper-capitalism. Somehow we're not cynical enough about them, but everything else. So let's be clear. All forms of the media in our world have values. So take the time to understand whose values you're supporting with the information you consume and figure out what you want to support. I also want to urge you to actually support the forms of media that you value, because so many of them in this digital world do not have a clear path to support. If we do this, we will be less like the game of picture telephone, as fun as that was to watch. Because how many of us have passed on something sometime in recent years and realized that maybe it wasn't 100% accurate? I know I have. It is important for us to have that accurate information and to remember that we still have many ways to have it. Especially around controversial issues, I follow some of the journalistic principles I got as a student at J School, tracking multiple sources, trying hard never to pass on anything that I haven't triple-checked, and trying very hard to differentiate opinion, which I value, from fact, which I need for a different reason. You know, there are a lot of people out there right now trying to get us information. Have you Googled your elected representatives recently? Have you put them in your search engine? because many of them are holding town halls and other events to try to get information out to you because it's not being covered in the media. And many of us are looking for other ways to think about what we do together to support those who are in public office. In these times, one of our spiritual practices and one of our real acts of resistance is to consider getting information about how we can participate in all kinds of activities, including the economic boycott that's being called this Friday, when we're being asked not to not participate in the market, but to boycott the large corporations who have actually decided that their profit is more important than our democracy. Here is the thing. We will always have the power to name our own truths, and yet to be sure that this is true and that we don't experience which too many in our congregation have already experienced. Let us be educated, and let's educate those around us. Let's take the time to support those who are still working to give us accurate information. Let us be the people who uphold the values, who remember that facts have dignity, that facts have nuance, that facts are based on scientific evidence and not spin. Let us be the people who communicate that facts should drive agendas, that truth should actually not be driven by agendas. Let us remember that our economy is supposed to serve us, to allow us as people to thrive and not to enslave us to some kind of groupthink. Let us support independent media as it exists today and not just yearn for a return of the era of buggy whips, because it's not coming back in that form again, my friends. We don't need our typewriters back, although my computer keyboard would be glad if they got a little bit of a rest from my right hand. We do need an economy that is not devoid of values. We do need a democracy strong enough to take on the real issues before us, founded on the values of our founding leaders, many of which espoused the values that are professed right here. And in the words of Langston Hughes, we need a set of actions that will give us the peace so that we can know, again, the reality of our dreams. May truth be our beacon and courage our guide.